And I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. Welcome to our students and faculty and especially guests. We had a lot of alums and other guests from other universities and other institutions email, which I think just shows the excitement about Dr. Jason Williams and all of his work. And so I have the great pleasure of introducing him today. Dr. Jason Williams is a passionate activist criminologist, deeply concerned about racial and gender disparity and mistreatment within the criminal legal system. He's a New Jersey native, so I know there's some folks here from New Jersey, raised from his grandmother in a housing project, which ultimately led him to pursue a doctorate in the administration of justice from Texas Southern University. Aside from publishing in the academic arena, his perspectives are also posted on several public outlets, including the Hampton Institution, Truth Out, and NJ.com, amongst a lot of other outlets. I see his work all the time in public forums, which is really cool. He's been quoted by many local and national presses on issues concerning criminal and social justice. He's conducted ethnographic research in Baltimore, Maryland, and Ferguson, Missouri, following the police-involved tragedies of Freddie Gray and Michael Brown. He's also beginning police and community-based research in Newark, New Jersey, following the installment of a federal consent decree that proved pervasive unconstitutional policing practices. And he's also published extensively on returning citizens and their navigation through reentry. And lastly, he published a co-edited book called Black Males in the Criminal Justice System, which I have here, would highly recommend it. So I just wanted to plug your book. Yeah, of course. And so what I think I will do is I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Jason Williams. I'm going to let him speak for as long as he wants to. And then we'll go ahead and have some time, hopefully at the end, for a Q&A. All right, does that sound good? All right, so welcome to Dr. Jason Williams.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I am going to share this screen really quickly. Confirmation that you all see it? You all see? Okay. Let me get this. It used to be what, F5? There you go. Yeah, so it is really, I'm keeping it plain so everyone can like see the the writing on the screen. Sometimes I put the little fancy back, right, designs and all of that. Then sometimes I say, let me just keep it plain. But again, it is really an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you today to go over some of the research that I've done and that I continue to do. And thanks, Dr. Amr, for reaching out, and to the students as well who had a hand and putting all of this together. So what I'm going to talk to you all today is about unpacking racialized social control. And this is something that I try to do with pretty much all of the work that I do in our discipline. But I do it through the use of qualitative research, qualitative criminology, as some of us like to call it. So today, I'm going to do that through foregrounding narratives from the margin. So I'm going to pull from some of my research around reentry as well as policing. And I'm going to do so through essentially the bringing together of three different presentations, right? But it's all together. It's all one presentation, so to speak. So first, I want to touch on the production of criminological knowledge, because I want to foreground for us the importance of qualitative criminology, why it is important for our discipline to pay attention to qualitative criminology, but also to sort of get at some of the pejorative statements, if you will, that have been sort of argued, against qualitative criminology. And then we're going to go into racialized social control, and then we will end with looking at some of the narratives from the two studies that I am going to use today. So in starting off with the production of criminological knowledge, when we think about the current state of qualitative criminology, these are some of the questions that I want us to think about as we go through the next few slides. Is it marginalized? How do we use it in classes? So this is from the perspective of both faculty and students. Do we encourage students and colleagues to pursue such projects? So whether it be through the peer review processes, whether it be on thesis, dissertation committees, so forth and so on, Why is it often labeled as research or activist scholarship? I myself do identify as an activist criminologist, an activist scholar. But then also what may be the power dynamics inherent in how we might interface with this genre of criminology, meaning whether or not we partake in it, right? Or whether we sit on the sidelines and, again, engage in those pejorative statements or labeling. So the production of knowledge and pedagogical practices, when again, in defining it, right, according to Sudbury Okinawa Ray, they would say, well, it's all about the engagement with and in service of progressive social movement. So in other words, when we think about activist scholarship, most of the time, to some degree, it is qualitative in nature, right? It's people-based. It isn't necessarily partisan. It perhaps isn't objective in the classical sense, right? And it is built from an ontology, knowledge-based that is opposite of the mainstream, right? So mainstreamers would take immediate issue with activist criminologists on the grounds of partisanship, if you will. However, right, what we do know is that, mainstream or orthodox criminology is also not without critique, right? Walters would describe mainstream knowledges as those criminologies that are sympathetic to the needs of the state, or what state prescriptions of crime would be. The bulk of mainstream literature, he would also say, is uncritical of what he would label as the mainstream, or the status quo. It doesn't delve into new territory, for instance, whether we are talking about methodological exploration or theoretical exploration. This is something that Stanley Cohen, of course, explored in Against Criminology, and one of my faves, Richard Quinney, when he, in this treatise here, The Social Reality of Crime, really delved into many of those deep epistemic arguments around the social construction of crime. Walters, again, further said that, well, look, criminological works that deviate from the norm are considered deviant knowledges. So that is to say, then, that qualitative works within the sort of grand scheme of things would then be considered deviant knowledges, right? So we don't go there because those works are deviant. That which is critical of the state, right? That which is critical of crime control apparatuses, that which challenges existing social and political orders. So if one engages in such kind of work, then they are indeed deviant. And so when we think about one of those questions that I asked you all earlier, well, how might we unpack the power dynamics that might be inherent in all of this type of labeling, right? Activist criminologists are often forced to have to wear political labels, right? But again, the power dynamics I asked you to think about. Why do they exist? What purpose do they serve? Think about the hierarchies that they create, right? How these hierarchies in many ways underscore what is research and what isn't, and through these discourses, I often argue that is how the game to some degree is exposed as far as whether or not the discipline is truly democratically inclusive, right? And of course, easily evidenced by touring through some of the top journals, where oftentimes there is preference to quantitative analyses. But again, as I often argue, scientific disciplines ought not be selective, right? Scientific disciplines should be open to all forms of scholarship, whether they are in favor of the state or in favor of other kinds of ways of knowing or perspectives. But these conflicts exist within the mainstream, right? Because we have frankly been unwilling to accept broader ontologies and epistemologies. Russell's development, for instance, back in '92, spoke about the development of a Black criminology. And she says that this will come from an ontological framework of really understanding the frustration of Black criminologists, understanding that Black criminologists have long felt ignored by the discipline. That whether we are looking at theoretical frameworks, methodological frameworks, or otherwise, Black criminologists have continuously felt underestimated, rarely been credited for the work that they have done, and that therefore there needs to be this sort of reconstitution of Black thought within the discipline, because after all, Black criminologists tend to see the crime problem differently. But again, those hierarchies, those power dynamics, right, and a governing ethos, if you will, within the discipline that sort of demands us to deny or to rather deprive our social selves, to sort of disconnect further from our research subjects. And this is something, for instance, that Mills and Collins, for instance, would readily disagree with, right? Readily disagree with. And I would argue that more than ever, as criminologists, we need to expand on the ways in which we might see the crime problem, if you will, and even social control more broadly, particularly in this era, right? Particularly in this era with so many changes happening. We need to be open to equally other ways of knowing and constructing knowledge. I think this is the only way in which we can truly be a democratically inclusive discipline. Science, true science, is supposed to be democratic. It's supposed to be open to equally other ways of knowing. And if we recall at Joanne Belknap's conference at ASC back in 2014, the great Brian Stevenson sort of asked us to become more proximate with our research subjects, right? He noted the importance of that. And we certainly know that he's proximate, right? He's proximate with everything that he does. And recall also to talk to share with you all Giroux's quote, right? In what ways is the university historically and presently complicit with modes of intellectual reification and instrumentalization that inevitably leads to violence, humiliation, torture, and war? And beyond this, an even larger question, for what purposes and for whom is knowledge pursued and advanced? So when we hide behind notions of neutrality and objectivity, which is a maxim within this discipline in particular, I redirect you back to Henry Giroux's quote, right? Because it is important to understand that ultimately we are taking a stand one way or another, right? One way or another. So we have to think about, the inferences that our research draws, whether, whether they are blatant, right? Or whether they are hidden. So in foreground and positionality, because again, when we think about some of the pejorative notions that are ultimately attached to qualitative criminology, and I say ultimately because of how we often teach research methodologies and such, I think talking a little bit about positionality is key. So for me, in the aftermath of the Mike Brown, Freddie Gray police-involved shootings, I indeed traveled to both of these sites. And I engage in several qualitative methodologies to learn more about the relationships between those communities and their police departments. And of course, I'm doing similar research here at home in Jersey. North New Jersey is also under consent decree. And then, of course, some of my reentry studies here in Northern New Jersey, among other such qualitative pursuits. But I will argue similarly to Russell, and again, we just spoke about her article with the reconstitution of a Black criminology, I believe that my positionality does help tremendously, and it adds to the discipline by tapping into those untapped knowledges, if you will, right? People who were more likely to sort of trust me because of my unique cultural affinity and understanding to their plight. I come from the same background as these people. I look like them. I have this sort of insider and outsider sensibilities. And I would argue that the knowledges contained in these projects are crucial and absolutely necessary if we are to truly and forthrightly understand the problems that plagues us today, frankly. And if we are to truly educate our students on many of these issues, and particularly many of the issues around race and justice, race and policing, the carceral state, you name it. Issues around gender, right? The list can go on and on and on. But when it comes to researching on quote unquote hard to reach populations, positionality is key. And in other social scientific disciplines, positionality has been long a maxim in their research canon that has been widely accepted. But in criminology, for whatever reason, we are still having to talk about this. And again, I want us to think a little bit about the hierarchies, the power dynamics that are perhaps attached to that. And again, for whom, right? For what purpose does that serve? So moving into the racialized social control, we have to move towards institutionalizing historically and racially appropriate frameworks. So these are just a couple of theories or frameworks that I often like to talk about in some of my own research that I think could help us in that on that path. So obviously critical race theory, which we don't see enough of this within criminology by Bale, but then we know that there were various other legal scholars that came along and added to this. But critical race theory really got its start out of critical legal studies, right? Because there were scholars within a legal academy who were already thinking in very social sciencey kind of ways about, legal institutions and even some of the broader institutions in society and how they collude and collide with race and gender, ethnicity, and other kinds of social identifiers to create these remarkable outcomes for citizens as they matriculate through systems and institutions. And when we think in particularly about how one must navigate the criminal legal system, critical race theory, I think, provides a consummate framework that we should and could be using in our research to make better sense of racialized outcomes. And let me just say, not only from the vantage point of individuals, individual decision-making processes, but also from the vantage point of the behavior of law and agencies. And we're going to get to that a little bit later, but it is important that we understand that because critical race theory, I think, pushes us to really unpack the behavior of law, right? The behavior of law and agencies as instruments of white supremacy, as instruments of violence. And when we think about criminology in particular, some of the earlier schools of radical and critical criminology tried to get us to pay attention to that, right? They've helped to provide some frameworks for understanding the importance of theorizing on the state, right? And theorizing on the law. But we may have lost our way on the importance of paying attention to those factors. Now, intersectionality, which has become sort of almost a buzz term, but I'm sure most of us know about it. It's also key, right, in terms of understanding differences within race, for instance. Kimberly Crenshaw's 89 article looked at, the legal context of discrimination, therefore arguing that, listen now, discrimination is not universal. Right? Black men and Black women don't experience discrimination and racism as a monolith within the American judicial system and within other governing institutions, right? But that we must look at the differences between the genders and even other separating identifiers. And when we think about this within the context of criminal justice, and I'm going to skip down to Hillary Potter's piece because it kind of goes together, where she argued for a disruption within the criminology, it becomes very important that we begin to understand that people cycle through this system differently, depending on these social identifiers, which in many ways infer these sort of historical markers that should also be part of our analyses, right? Which can, frankly, also be included in quantitative analyses if you do it effectively, right? The right way. But again, Hillary states that, the discipline is supremely ineffective when analyzing crime and social control for people of color. And that most mainstream theories and theorists lack the nuance necessary to seriously contend with the issue that we face in US society, right? The nuance, because reality is not as simple as we often like it to be, or as we make it out to be, which is essentially, which is a part of American exceptionalism, right? To make things very simple and not to really unpack the, the comprehensiveness, if you will, of things such as racism and white supremacy and gender bias and transphobia and things of that sort, right? These types of isms and structures come about in very comprehensive ways And so it takes comprehensive theories and frameworks to unpack them. And so it's time, I would argue, that criminology begins to use them. We've already gone over Russell Brown's, the development of Black criminology, but then with Georgia Sebei's article on petit apartheid, which is also criminally undercited, most people I find don't know much about it. He likens the disparities within the system to a petit apartheid system, right? Arguing that justice remains the reality of advantage for some and disadvantage for others. And in unpacking his thesis, he states that, look, this is a reality at every stage in the system. And he pays, for me, what was really interesting in this is how he even looks at the jury, right? How he even looks at the jury, which is also something that is sort of criminally understudied in the discipline. The role of the jury, right? And the racial disparities that we see, particularly at the stages of the court. Now, I know here in Jersey, there was an article that came out recently in one of our local papers. We're supposed to be now recalibrating, how we put juries together, and it's supposed to be, this concerted effort to undo racial bias and things of that sort. So we'll see, what happens with that. But I can recall in the aftermath, if you all, I hope you do, in the aftermath of the Trayvon Martin in versus Zimmerman, if you remember, there was a Black Latina who came out and said there were some funky things happening in that jury box, right? But I wonder, how might we as a discipline begin to unpack, what that is and the role that perhaps play in, some of the racial disparities that we see, again, at the stages of the court, Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve recently had written a book too, that looks at some of those things. And and it's a very welcome contribution to the discussion, but we need more of that, more of it. Anderson's newest theory on the iconic ghetto, which really adds to some of Du Bois's work on, the color line, right? What might be the modern day color line? How might we contextualize that? But in this notion of the iconic ghetto, he talks more broadly about, this ideological association with Blacks as always attached to the ghetto, right? Always attached within the geography of the ghetto. So it doesn't matter if you had never even had an attachment with the ghetto, right? So you might have grown up in the Black middle class and have no attachment to the ghetto, know nothing about the ghetto, but every time you surface in society and a non-Black sees you, you're automatically attached with the ghetto. And you're interfacing with that exterior part of society is, again, within the context of a Black from the ghetto. And we know how Blacks from the ghetto are debased, right, and dehumanized and so forth. So he calls that sort of navigating the white space. And then, of course, these last three pulls from Fanon's work on, colonialism for the most part. And so Cruz's work on internal colonialism, which I used in my own chapter in the book that Marissa held up, laments that African Americans are entrapped within a system of domestic colonization. And he states that this is consistent with third world living standards. And so we have to, again, contextualize this within the broader historical reality of Blacks within this country, right? And this could also be, frankly, on par with other historically colonized peoples within this country. So whether we're talking about Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and so forth, right? Puerto Ricans, right? Other historically colonized individuals. And he talks about this lack of political authority, right? They are sort of, unable to effectuate change on themselves and in their communities, a couple of years back, there was these discussions within the reentry literature around community efficacy. I'm sure some of us remember that. And within that literature, I think, too, a lack of critical engagement with what that term means, right? Because how can a community, in fact, have community efficacy if they've not been ever given the tools and ability to have it to begin with, right? And so This is similar to the term desistance as well, but that's a whole sort of other topic. But Staples' White Racism, Black Crime, and American Justice is yet another framework that builds on colonial thesis. Where he also says that the colonial analogies views the Black community as an underdeveloped colony, right? Whose economics and politics are controlled by the racially dominant class. So again, when you look at that within the context of voter suppression, right? When you look at that within the context of the criminal justice system as a tool of racialized social control through felon disenfranchisement. So when you look at some of those southern states and how many Black men in particular have been pulled off the voting, right? The voting polls, if you will, and you juxtapose that against historical practices of voting disenfranchisement, the reality is pretty striking, right? And then Tatum, in her construction of the colonial model, really takes a look at she focuses in on law enforcement. She goes that, well, law enforcement role in the colonial system is to put oppression and domination into practice, with the clear conscience that they are the, quote, upholders of the peace, quote unquote, right? But of a peace that is totally disruptive to the true way of life and self-determination of those whom they are paid to oversee. And so what I would argue is that when we look at some of these theoretical frameworks, perhaps they are most ethically appropriate for some of the populations that we see having problems with policing, with reentry, right? You name it. Perhaps they are most ethically appropriate when we're studying some of these populations today, right? And it goes at the heart of democratizing criminological literature. And not only the literature, because if you look back at some of these frameworks, they can also be, they can also speak to methodology in many ways, right? If you know how to do it creatively. But now foregrounding history and appropriate frameworks, I think, we have to look at slavery and the slave codes, for instance, right? The institutionalization, if you will, of the Black surveillance complex at the behest of white supremacy. We know what was going on here. We also understand the legacy of this period to today's processes and realities of both Blacks, whites, right, Native, and every other group that is here with us today. When we look at what happened at the Capitol and its aftermath and so forth and so on, it's part and parcel of past legacies of racialized social control, power, and privilege. Radical Reconstruction. Yes, during this period, Black freedoms were subtly acknowledged, but yet swiftly challenged. We had the creation of white hate groups, the KKK, right, which came about to swiftly challenge newfound Black freedoms. We had the creation of new penal systems like the convict leasing system, which readily, in many ways, returned newly freed Blacks back onto the plantations from which they were just freed, right? And in this context, which we don't often talk about, many of them were forced to work to their literal deaths. Because look, if I'm a plantation owner, there are more of you to come, right? So no longer do I have to take care of you, feed you, and clothe you, because I'm leasing you, right? And through Pigg's Law and other such draconian laws that were created for the purposes of racially targeting you all, I don't have to worry about, making sure that your health, your health is in check and so forth. Jim Crow, the reemergence of white supremacy via changes in the behavior of laws and agencies, right? And the behavior of laws and agencies. And so again, as a discipline, we need to begin to pay more attention to the behavior of laws and agencies and not be so focused on the behaviors of individuals per se. The post-civil rights retaliation era, again, changes in the behaviors of laws and agencies. Now we understand, what happened in the 60s and 70s, with the civil rights movement and all the other movements for massive social change. That's why most commentators associate the 80s, right, the reemergence of the conservative agenda, and as Barbara Hudson and some commentators within our discipline would call administrative criminologies, right, would come about and sort of wipe away cleanly all of the sort of rehabilitative literatures and procedures that came about as a result of the 60s and the 70s. And then, of course, through Michelle Alexander's treatise, we have the new Jim Crow, right? African Americans as a permanent undercast as a matter of law and custom. Because as we know, just because something is a law doesn't mean that by custom, right, people are not still practicing, negative frameworks of the past or inhumane frameworks of the past. And I would argue that these frames absolutely inform today's processes and the matriculation of Blacks as they go through the criminal justice system. Now, when I talk about the behavior of laws and agencies, I think that's when we need to turn to criminal justice theory, right, which is different from criminological theory. So Kroska, I was introduced to this in Kroska's 2006 article, Setting the Infrastructure for Criminal Justice Theory. And then I think there's a subtitle to that. But if you just Googled that, it should pop up. I think it's on his ResearchGate as well. But he also has a book. And then McGuire and Duffy also has a book on it. But what they argue, essentially with criminal justice theory, is that as a discipline, we need to focus also on the behavior of the state, right? The behavior of laws and agencies, because they are not above reproach, right? They are not above reproach. And their behavior, right? And the products of law have a deleterious effect ultimately on the people that come in contact with it. So for instance, a person's stay in prison can have implications on public safety once they are returned, right, to the community. So we need more focus on criminal justice theory, and hopefully in critical context, right? Focus on race, gender, sexuality and different things of that sort, identity and so forth. But hyper focus on the individual has allowed the actions of the state to continue basically without criticism. And this is how we've arrived to this new Jim Crow era, right? This is how we arrived to it. So now I want to move to the narratives from the margins. I'm going to use two of these studies these are already published. The first one I did with Leah and Mayane Funa, who I think I saw with us today, Creating and Undoing Legacies of Resilience, Black Women as Martyrs in the Black Community and Under Oppressive Social Control. So these narratives were collected in Baltimore, Maryland, in a larger study around policing. Study number 2, Health Implications of Incarceration and Reentry on Returning Citizens, a qualitative examination of Black males' experiences in the Northeastern city with Sean Wilson and Carrie Burgenson. And they're in these two respective journals, so Women in Criminal Justice and the American Journal of Men's Health. So with Creating and Undoing Legacies, we wanted to look at the struggles and contributions of Black motherhood and reproductive justice. So, looking at the themes that really spoke to these two issues through semi-structured interviews, regarding their experiences and perceptions of policing, particularly during the aftermath of Freddie Gray. But other things came up, as you could imagine, prior to this incident. And while the literature in this area focuses on Black males, right, most of the time, little is actually known about the struggles and contributions of Black mothers in matters concerning police brutality, because it is a gendered issue, right? It is a gendered issue in many ways. And so our primary themes in this paper show that Black women indeed are subject to terror from the police, right, and other system agents. So by that we mean, up here we call them diapers, but like CPS, truancy officers and such, the schools, but they also face reproductive justice issues as they are criminalized as mothers. Because reproductive justice issues must go beyond the biological, the physiological, right? It goes beyond that. But they are also affected mentally. And they develop strategies of resilience to try to overcome it. So it is paramount then that we begin to analyze the role of the state. Again, going back to criminal justice theory, the need to analyze the behavior of agencies, the behavior of law as well. And as I mentioned, law enforcement, child protective services, truancy officers, and so forth and so on. The state, as we know, has historically attempted to reduce Black women as mothers. And this, again, is a historical trope and process dating back to the slave plantations. And Jones and Seabrook, Chanel Jones, my fellow classmate, have referred to the denial of Black mothers as the new Jane Crow, right? The new Jane Crow. And Roberts, again, declared the coercive relationship between Black women and their children in the criminal justice system and the foster care system. She states they're all interconnected mechanisms to deny the significant institution or contributions, rather, of Black women as mothers. And this, despite the fact that they often cared for the children of white women, right? From slavery up through Jim Crow, and in some cases, even today, right? With the vast majority of that labor coming from, immigrant Black women, Black women that are coming from, typically from the Caribbean, right? So the hypocrisy in this mislabeling is remarkable. But one of the themes that we are going to share here today is the police and system terror. So our participants noted a deep fear of dealing with the police. They were deathly afraid. Most attempted to avoid altogether. But in this case, Deborah did feel the need to have to interface with the state, okay, because she was having some issues with one of her daughters. So she states that, so in my experience with the police, it's with them coming into my home. They never asked me any questions. They never looked at me and said, well, it is a possibility that this child is the one that is rebelling. So from her vantage point, you automatically come into my house, you snatch my child, you told me I was an unfit mother, you had me go into all of these different programs, parenting classes. I'm 51 years old. There's nothing you can teach me about being a mother. Now let's pause here. The state basically condemning her to parenting classes at 51 years old. If I don't know that by now, I will never know, because I love my child so much. I was willing to degrade myself, sitting in here with 18-year-olds who don't have a clue about how to be a mother. Now, let's put in further context here. Deborah has other children. So had she not attended those classes, what might have happened to those other children? And again, a CPS case that came about as a result of Deborah calling the police for help with one of her children. Now, her story is distinct from Collins's thesis, right? Description of Black mother strategies, because, again, typically Black mothers will try to limit. They will try to limit their contact with the state, right? But because of the intersecting oppressions that she faces, she had no choice but to capitulate to the state for help on this matter. No choice. No choice. Janet expressed how, look, back in the day, it was the white police officers, who used to hit on us. So, she talked a little bit about the histories of sexual harassment that Black women used to face in Baltimore City. But then also, if you look at this narrative, right, she says, but Black cops, right, but Black cops were the ones that disappointed me to a certain degree because they seem to be harder on Black men than the white officers. And even today, that still exists. They just wanted to discipline us. And throughout the entire sample, this is what we've gathered for the most part, right? That from the perspective of our Black participants, it was the Black cops that wanted to discipline them the most. Now, Collins laments that Black mothers feel the need to socialize their daughters for a world that does not see them nor accept them. So Elaine, 43 years old, vividly detailed an instance of racial profiling that she explained traumatized her 3 decades earlier. So again, at 13 years old. So again, when we think about police brutality being gender specific to Black males, we need to think again. So I was about 13. I was coming out of my building in the projects, and I'm going towards 7-Eleven. My mother sent me to the store, so the police threw me on the wall. Now, remind you, I'm only 13 years old. 13 years old. I know nothing about drugs, nothing about none of that. But I got thrown on the wall. Me and some grown adults and some neighbor guys. But because I fit a description of another young lady, another young lady that was older than me. I'm 13. This young lady was in her 20s. I got thrown on the wall. disrespected, and all this type of stuff. Now let's go back to Collins' quote up here, right? Where she laments that Black mothers feel the need to socialize their daughters for a world that does not see them nor accept them. When Hillary argues for the need of an intersectional criminology, when Crenshaw talks about intersectionality, when Derek Bell talks about, and all of his colleagues, right, talks about critical race theory and all of these other critical frameworks, right? And much of the Black feminist literatures, right? Hence the citing of Collins here. When we talk about the inclusion of these critical frameworks, they are necessary if we are to truly understand the levels of victimization that happened here for Elaine. Because it goes deeper than just being thrown on that wall by police officers, right? It is about what happened to Elaine's mother when she found out that this happened to her child. What happened to her? What were the levels of vicarious trauma in that household? How did her father perhaps feel? How did her brothers feel when they learned that Elaine, at 13 years old, was suspected of having dealt with drugs? With Black mother and reproductive justice, this is another theme, our participants' insight conveys that motherhood is used as a tool to control Black women. And there is a vast array of literature, Susila Gurshami, Janet Garcia Hillette, I mean, so many others have written on this. The ways in which Black women parent their children are policed and they are punished erroneously, especially when seeking resources to help parent their children more effectively. We've seen this, right, with the earlier quote. Because of those intersecting oppressions, they often have no other outlets or resources. And so oftentimes you have to capitulate to a welfare system that is often punitive by its very design. And this poses a reproductive justice threat to Black mothers, a reproductive justice threat. And the daily terror, experience from the police by Black women potentially puts their children at risk, right, of being entangled in a system. They can become homeless or at risk of suffering mental health abnormalities themselves, as reported by some of these mothers. Deborah conveyed constantly seeking help for her daughter, who kept running away. And she was running away because they lost their grandfather, who was beaten to death by the police. This was how they entered into the study to begin with. And so Deborah called the police out of desperation. She needed to get help for her daughter, and she had to turn to the very institution that caused her daughter to run away in the first place. To only be beaten herself. Moreover, the constant jailing and killing of Black bodies from the vantage point of participants. This robs them, Black mothers, of their right to both parent and raise their children. Qualitatively similar to slavery, when Black babies were snatched from their Black mothers and sold off into slavery. It is most certainly a reproductive justice matter. And it is so even in instances when their children are adults. Yes, Freddie Gray was an adult. It is still a reproductive justice matter for his mother. So when Black mothers are denied motherhood, at the hands of the state, we need to begin to, again, reconceptualize that for what it is. And again, in the minds of these mothers, it is a reproductive justice issue, And I remember Vendera Myers, when I was down there in the St. Louis area, I was Kiana, who is a former student of your program. And she was taking me around, and she took me to the memorial up there, and lo and behold, Vendera Myers' family, they were coming to the memorial to clean it up and bring additional items or what have you. And I will never forget the conversation we had with his mother and how she felt as if the media was constructing her as an unfit Black mother. That somehow, the entire situation was her fault. because as the Black mom, she did not raise him correctly. Now, mind you, the father was there. The father was there, right? So what type of mental health abnormalities is she now going to develop as a result of that added pressure? So now moving on to study number 2, we're almost near to the end. The health implications of incarceration. This paper unpacks the struggles of Black men in Northern New Jersey as they navigate returning home. And it pays very close attention to apparent and hidden health implications that we typically miss with this population. And that is typically absent in criminological studies around reentry. So through semi-structured interviews, right, we looked at their experiences navigating reentry, and interviews were geared to probe questions around race and gender-specific health implications. And so while the literature, again, disproportionately focuses on traditional reentry quarrels, we, again, rarely look at some of the mental health issues that incarceration exacerbates, and particularly when we look at the social determinants of health of this population. And so we have to use the term exacerbates because, again, for these historically marginalized individuals, it is already established that they come to prison oftentimes with mental health abnormalities already, right? So primary themes show that Black men's mental health is severely affected by these processes, right? Gender-specific torture from the perspective of these participants is omnipresent. It is an omnipresent factor in their daily lives. And what was very interesting for us in this particular paper was the role of masculinity. The role of masculinity and how it played a distinct form of punishment on the psyches of these men. So we came up with the term divergent masculinity in a former paper, but we use it in this paper because, it was a very apparent theme for us. So what is it? A unconventional cycle in which Black men navigate to build one's sense of manhood through an unpredictable, risky, and often painful continuum ripe with structural inequality and racism, among other factors, right? And the logics of divergent masculinity ultimately trace back through slavery, right? And again, through processes of emasculation. And so we know how emasculation occurred on the slave plantation. We know that. And so from then up through, right, these processes have continued, whether it's through economic deprivation and other wider, broader sort of political, social deprivations. Black men, for the most part, have been denied the plight of true masculinity within a society that is what? Patriarchal, right? And so even minus their interfacing with the criminal legal system, Black men are still subject to this kind of repetitive and constant torture of being, disabled from the fraternity, right? From the fraternity of masculinity. And of course, we have certainly our critiques of, right, heteropatriarchy and masculinity and all of that writ large, but it is still incumbent upon us to theorize and analyze these experiences. So it played a profound role on the psyches of these men while they were incarcerated. And when it came to fathering, Tariq, for instance, said, well, my daughter came and I got to think about her. And, and if I go, right, meaning like if he were to be killed or something like that, who is going to protect her? Who is going to show her what she should be doing in life and everything else? I'm going through it. So I know what to do and what not to do. So maybe she'll listen to me because I'm going through it. And so for many of these men, it was through navigating incarceration that they found their sense of fatherhood, which is strikingly remarkable. Strikingly remarkable, right? But imagine sitting in a cell and coming to that realization and not quite being able to materialize as a father. The men in the study displayed a profound inclination toward learned hopelessness and helplessness, and this was primarily attached to their sense of masculinity. And again, in normal society, if you will, they are already experiencing, right? For those who subscribe to the need for masculinity, they are already experiencing this. And so the interfacing with incarceration and the system further exacerbates this. Many believe the system was punishing them precisely because they were Black and men. So for instance, when asked about his stay in prison, Joe said, for instance, it made me stronger. It made me think out of the box. Think about that, right? It made me stronger. This is where I can die. And I had to think about what I had to do to protect myself. Now, he's saying this in an American prison, right? So that's when I cut off all phone calls and all letters or whatever. So in order to maintain himself, his sense of masculinity, his sense of serenity, if you will, he had to cut off all letters, all communications to his loved ones. So he believed that to survive in prison, he had to, again, cut ties with everybody he knows. And he purported, along with most others in the study, that showing emotion in prison could be a major fault. Could be a major fault. Now, we must think as criminologists, right, the public health implications that this can have on the community and really on, people in their lives at home. Domestic violence, for instance. Barry, talking about his in-prison experiences, mentioned, quote, "It is just how you use your mind and how you go about the survival tactics." So he, appears to describe the prison as a hypermasculine argon in which one has to develop a kill or be killed mentality. And again, might I remind us, in an American prison. Cecil recalled his upbringing while rationalizing the culture of the prison. So, for instance, I've lost friends. I've lost a lot of friends. What do you expect? I ran with a freaking rowdy ass neighborhood, of course, so I lost friends. And I had one friend shot clean in front of me while we were in a car at the park with his daughter. So how do you think that make me feel? Do I tend to cry about it? No, it's just a freaking war-worn heart. I just go along with my day. I haven't grown cold to it. I just put it in the freaking closet and locked it up. Many of these types of people are sitting in there. And when we think about how this exacerbates already existing abnormalities, right? And subscribing to hypermasculinity is already an issue, right? But how might the prison exacerbate this and frankly promote it? And so this connects to our last theme we're covering here today on mental health, right? So as respondents replied to inquiries around violence in the jails and prisons, their replies were overwhelmingly grounded again in that hypermasculine verbiage, which was again bolstered, I think, by the prison. So more strikingly, their sense of hopelessness and helplessness stood out above all else. So Cecil, again, anybody that's been locked up can vouch for it. When you're locked up, it is certain shit you see in there and here that to the average person, it'll possibly make them hang it up. I done heard people get raped. I done heard people get stabbed. I done heard freaking people stomping their head in right by the cell door. Like I said, after a couple of months, you tend to get used to that shit. So it's like, fuck it. So we argued that their stay in the prison contributed to what we coin institutional coerced abandonment of consciousness, which is, as we define it, the act of the state via processes inherent within its power, right? So again, going back to criminal justice theory, to disjoint a person from their prior self mentally through the use of tremendous roadblocks and pressures that are typically racialized, gendered, and classed. And a core consequence of which is the victim, if you will, falling to previous behavior that landed them in jail to begin with. And the cyclical reality, in many ways, forces them to depend on controlled substances, which was a theme we've seen with many of these individuals, which in turn also forces the victim to blame themselves, which is a maxim of neoliberal penality and justice in the modern day American criminal justice system. Because even as these individuals cycle through community corrections, as we often call them, right, probation and parole, they are fed countless literatures and go through countless rehearsals of you did this to yourself and it's only on you to fix yourself. And like society had nothing to do with it. Racism, structural inequalities, barriers, and so forth had nothing to do with where you are today. And we could see it within the interviews, how they responded to certain inquiries and certain probes. There was this complete abandonment of consciousness. Complete abandonment of consciousness. On the one hand, acknowledging the faults of COs and the mistreatment within the correctional system, but then now on the outside, not necessarily believing that it is the fault of the state to not help them get back on their feet. Where does that come from? Right? Where does that come from? And perhaps it is part and parcel of a system that forces you to abandon your consciousness, or else you will be returned back to that cell. So under this context, ICAC victims' behavior is conceptualized, as I mentioned, as individual infractions, separate and apart from institutional and structural barriers. And therefore, as we argue, increasing the spectrum for extreme mental health abnormalities, particularly amongst historically marginalized, incarcerated individuals. And again, many of whom were already inundated with unimaginable mental health crises already, right? That perhaps are gendered. So I welcome you all to go and pull those two articles. There's a lot more to get from those. But in conclusion, again, to go back to sort of tie them all together, at this critical moment, I do think that the discipline is unfortunately irrelevant to many people on the ground. When we think about the movements, Black Lives Matter, and various other social movements, but even to some students sitting in our very classes, whether that be undergraduates, graduate students, master's, doctoral, right? The discipline may appear pretty irrelevant, right? And this is sadly our reality in the backdrop of tremendous disarray, right, within the administration of justice. So the constant ceremonies of state violence every other day, violence against Black folks at the hands of the police, the transphobic violence that we see every day but don't talk about, institutionalized sexual violence. We've had a big issue right here in our only state prison for women. We're still waiting to see what happens with that. You should look that up. There was a DOJ report that dropped, that revealed things that we already knew because there had been news reports coming out about it. But each time we fail to humanize these issues, the discipline loses more and more legitimacy. And there are frameworks out there that we could use. The ones I had on my slides are just a few. There are many, many more. And I think that we could engage in the pursuit of creativity to create additional frameworks. I tend to see myself as almost like a creative artist in the work that I do, because again, I think that science should be a democratic practice, right? A democratic pursuit. I don't think that we should be hindered in how we practice science. Because to me, that's not science, right? To be told, well, no, you can only do it this way, that way. And that's not science to me. But the way forward for our discipline is toward adopting, as I like to say, these equally other ways of constructing knowledge, and including these equally other ways. Again, it's not an exercise in downgrading the old ways of, doing criminology and whatnot, but it's an exercise of actually being a science, embracing, as we like to say, right, these paradigmatic changes and experimentation, and allowing other voices to be included in the process. I would like to think that the two articles I shared today adds tremendously to the body of knowledge. And qualitative methodology has always been attractive to me because of its capacity to humanize. Like I said, being a creative person, doing qualitative research for me is like engaging in fugitive space. My relationship with the discipline is probably not as positive as many others. All three of my degrees is in criminal justice. And so I can recall some pretty, interesting moments sitting in classes and wondering, well, what are you talking about? Either whether it was a classmate or whether it was a faculty member. And so doing this kind of research is certainly is like engaging in fugitive space. It's being in fugitivity. It is being free from that which has long held me down. Like this space belongs to me too. I belong here as well. Science is supposed to be democratic. So it allows me to escape the violence that is called the mainstream. So in closing, I think we must understand that when we exclude these equally other ways of meaning making, right, whether implicitly or explicitly, and so this is, again, if we're reviewing for journals, if we are sitting on thesis, dissertation committees, on curriculum committee, whatever have you, then we are engaging in a kind of academic erasure and really a violence. And that contributes to the criminological ethos that I mentioned earlier. That is, frankly, inequitable, obviously, but, racist, perhaps even, exclusive, and it contributes to the discipline being obsolete to those who need us the most. So we need to be a conscience for society. So with that being said, I will unshare my screen and I will take questions.
And I think,
thank you so much.
So thank you, first of all. I know that.
Thank you.
Amazing talk. I know that we're at 12 o'clock, so if folks have other things, I totally understand, but maybe we could just take a couple questions and then I will, shift it over because I know that you're supposed to meet with the graduate students starting at noon. So does that work for you okay? Does anybody have any questions? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm looking for the Q&A box, so I guess they would be in the regular chat, right?
Yes, sorry, I'm not that great at Zoom. I don't know how to set that up. So if you do have a question, you can type it in the chat or you could just unmute yourself and say it.
I have a question, is that okay? Thank you so much. That was so interesting and I learned a lot. I'm wondering, I guess I've been talking a lot to my students about defunding the police, right, and abolishing the police, but hearing you talk about these other systems is also very punitive, made me rethink a lot. And I'm wondering, like, say a mayor came up to you and said, like, I'm interested in defunding the police, would you be reluctant to replace the police? And I don't know your views on defunding in general, but like, would you be reluctant to replace police officers with social service agents?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I have a lot of friends in social work who are problematizing these very issues, right? Because they understand how some of the institutions in social welfare have been pretty punitive. But I think that the fix to that is shifting those services to community-based organizations. So we do have a bill in New Jersey. I had so I testified to the Public Safety Committee to our assembly, and then I took that document and turned it into an op-ed. So there is a bill right now that, is going through the process that would actually earmark a couple $1 million to community-based groups. And so they're already out there doing it. I'm sure we all know a few community-based organizations that are out there, giving services to the community. And these services can be, whether it's mental health, right? Whether it's recreational and so forth. That could be another way to, quote unquote, defund and give, power back to the community. So it doesn't have to be state-sponsored institutions of social welfare.
Great, that makes so much sense. Thank you.
Dr. Williams, I have a question. So obviously a lot of these issues that you talk about are contentious even within the field. And I wonder a lot of the times when I read the work in the field, how do we communicate these ideas outside of an academic audience when we're even struggling to get agreement, like within people who are well studied to some degree on this?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Engaging with the community in ways that, so for instance, I've done a couple of marches over the past summer with the, in the aftermath of the Freddie Gray situation. And at some of these marches, I was asked to just simply speak, right? So that's one such way, right? And it can be a form of activism as well, but also community-based committees. So There's also a courthouse committee here. So our Supreme Court created a committee for East Vicinage that will look at minority issues or minority concerns, right? So I think as an academician, you have a unique perspective to provide to these types of committees, right? And they listen to some of the things that you have to say. That's one way in which you can do it. You can partner with some of these community-based organizations. You know, there are, you know, Black Lives Matter chapters. There's whatever your issue may be, right? So if you like to do work on gender, you can find organizations that do work on gender or juvenile justice and so forth and so on. You'd be surprised how welcoming they would be, right, to academics. But I think the onus is on us to do the work to get out there and to, you know, engage with these community-based organizations, but not to be over them, right? Not to be over them, but to be sort of like a resource. Now, another way of doing that, I think, is op-eds. Op-eds. Now, should there be somewhat of a cultural shift within academia where we are encouraged to do them? I think so. Most people probably don't engage in op-eds because, you know, they don't count, right, in one's packet. But I think we should do a lot more of them.
Are there any last questions? I think for grad students, maybe I'm going to have people just stay on the Zoom call, and so you can follow up and have a conversation, a deeper conversation with Dr. Williams. So at this time, I wanted to thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. We really appreciate your work and your perspective, and I think it's critically important time for criminology. So I just am a huge fan of your work. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so I wanted to have everybody else join me in thanking Dr. Williams.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
everybody, now I'm gonna try to do a little bit of social control on my part and kick out everybody who is not a graduate student, including myself. And then I believe, Fairnet, I have made you also the co-host, right? So you can help manage a little bit and give you all some time to, have a discussion with Dr. Jason Williams. So, all right. I think we are in pretty good shape here. So, all right, I will see you all later. And I will follow up and also make this recording available to, I will send you the link and send it around as well. All right. Thank you.
So hello.